समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Donald Trump is saying so much about India. He's got such a bee in his bonnet about India that it's difficult. It's impossible to keep track of what he's saying and the gyrations this is taking. Although lately almost everything he has said has been negative on India, bordering on the nasty. In fact, some of it has been downright nasty. However, if you know Trump, you also know that he says these things often about everybody, but particularly about his allies. You have any doubts about that? Please check with poor Canada, because Canadians have fought and died with Americans in so many wars, and yet from the day he's come to power for the second time, he's continued to insult, humiliate Canada. He's also imposed among the highest duties on Canada, and Canada, by the way, is his second largest trade partner. And for Canada, trade with America is a matter of survival. However, Canada is fighting back. It's not as if they've become adversaries or enemies. So you have to keep that in mind as you track Donald Trump, because Trump tracking now is becoming a specialized business. So what have we done? First of all, you cannot done it on a day-to-day basis, or because we are a cricketing society, we have a cricketing mind, on an over by over basis or a ball by ball basis. That's the reason we wrote this 50-word editorial today, that this is like dealing with Trump's diplomacy now. Trump 2 in Trump 2.0 era is a bit like keeping track of a T20 match, because with every ball the asking rate changes. So that might be good for a smile, but at this point we are at a juncture in dealing with this new America where it's better to deal it with a smile by keeping your mind or alert, and also keeping the sense of humor and composure and intellect to sift the chaff from grain, or in our language, to keep the clutter aside from the substance. Because as this talk is going on, so far because so far Donald Trump has not said that his trade delegation, which is scheduled to visit India on August 25th, he has not said that that visit is cancelled. That on that visit, that team with the Indian team is supposed to carry forward from where the trade deal stays now. In fact, there is also a quotation, also a statement from Piyush Goyal that we have from Financial Times. He spoke there last month. He said, "We are quite sure," I'm quoting Piyush Goyal, "we are quite sure we will have a good, robust agreement with the US." Looks like he's himself made a good progress with the US. In fact, we had a story from Robert Lighthizer, former US trade representative and negotiator's autobiography. He negotiated with the Modi government under Trump 1. And in so many ways, Lighthizer is the one who's given the credit for drafting or crafting this new Trumpian approach to global trade. So this reference we found in his memoir, "No Trade is Free." And see the reference to Piyush Goyal there. That's a very important reference, because he found Piyush Goyal smart, somebody positive, and somebody with whom he could do business. And he's the one fronting the Indian side now. So Donald Trump has not as yet said that this is off, right? He may say it tomorrow, I hope not, but who knows? That's the reason we have to step back a little bit. It's a bit like you're going through a flight which is turbulent every now and then, and you remember that line that flight captains, that pilots always speak, which is that we don't expect much turbulence after takeoff, 10 minutes after takeoff or 5 minutes after takeoff, or if there's turbulence, we'll let you know. But in a flight, it's always advisable to keep your seat belts fastened, at least loosely fastened, just in case we hit an unexpected bump. That is the state of the relationship with the US now, particularly in trade. Important thing is we are not the only ones. India is not the only one facing this trade bullying from Donald Trump. Many other countries are, many of them much closer to America geographically as well as geopolitically, and even those who might be treaty allies. So this is a very messy universe. We will talk about more of the trade issues going ahead as we get some clarity. Maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after. Right now, I will only tell you that the trade between the two countries is about $212 billion. It's a lot of trade. $212 billion. However, the interesting thing is, the important thing is, of this, the merchandise trade or the goods trade is about $130 billion, give or take $500 million, $130 billion. These are figures from the US Trade Representative's office, from their website. The rest, about $82 billion, is services trade. Services trade is not subject to duties or tariffs, as I keep explaining, because in this case, nothing crosses your border. So no customs duty, no tariffs are laid on services trade. However, it's important to note that India and the US are about even Stevens. Nobody has a deficit or surplus. It's about barabar, like 2-2, like the India-England cricket series. On merchandise, however, while the trade is about 130 billion, India exports about 87 billion. I'm rounding off the figures. The US exports to India about a little over 42 billion, which means the US carries a trade deficit of $45 billion. That has been the pain point with Donald Trump. That is the basic issue. Then he has brought in Russia, he's brought in other things. That tamasha is going on. Let us see where it goes. His envoy, Steve Witkoff, is now reaching Moscow. Let us see what happens between him and Putin. This situation is prone to dramatic turns. In fact, as I am speaking with you, my colleague Janki Dave tells me that Financial Times has just broken a story that a covert Iranian delegation has visited Moscow seeking some critical nuclear isotopes to help them move towards nuclear weaponization. Now, what we can see is that all over the world, squeeze play is going on. So this is also squeeze play by the Russians. Russians also said that they've lifted the restrictions on their own deployment of short range and medium range nuclear weapons, right? Trump said the other day that he's moving his 2 nuclear submarines. It's the first time you've seen the 2 largest holders, 2 nations with the largest inventory of nuclear weapons, talking about deployment either on social media or in public statements or speeches. But that is the kind of world we are living in right now. We must understand that. That's the reason. While we talk about trade, we will talk about trade in more detail in a day or two. We have to understand where we were, where we have reached, and what is the reason I say that in the India-US relationship, this is the Trump era, which might be much more prone to turbulence than what we've seen in the past. But there's always been turbulence, and at the same time, many periods of great comfort, good flying in the India-US relationship. Stay with me as I tell you the story of 5 strategic shifts that brought India closer to the US until this Trump disruption that we are dealing with now. In fact, when Obama came gracing the Republic Day parade in 2015, I had noted in a national interest that this will be the first time an American leader had been accorded that honor. Through our history, America had been a distant power we reached out to at junctures of desperate need. During the 1962 debacle, for example, Nehru wrote a letter to Kennedy asking for weapons, asking for fighter planes also, and plenty of US arms and training were also made available to India. It was in Nehru's last years that Americans even set up a military mission in New Delhi. That's not something that people remember even institutionally. And that was a military mission led by a full 2-star general in Delhi, but it was kept below the radar. Then Nehru died, Kennedy was assassinated, and that initiative or that outreach or that warmth sort of got dissipated. We were not at the same time, while we were seeking help with the Americans. We were not calling each other strategic allies. Pakistan was still America's strategic ally because Pakistan was a member of American security organizations, regional security organizations. The relationship between India and the US declined after the 1965 war with Pakistan, but we were back on friendly terms with PL 480, which was named for food aid. Once a series of droughts hit India, droughts had started in 64, 65, as we mentioned earlier, was a year of negative economic growth, negative by 2.6%. It was the toughest time for India. I've stood in ration queues as a kid, as a proxy for my mom those days. If the first half of the 1960s brought us American armaments and training, in 1965, American ships arrived at our ports laden with wheat. Then followed another freeze between 1969 and 1971. 1969 is when Mrs. Gandhi made her hard shift to the left. It was impossible in this period for a government to survive by inviting the US President as Republic Day chief guest. It was too risky in decades when anti-Americanism was the bedrock of non-alignment and thereby our foreign policy. That honor, accordingly, was reserved for non-aligned heads of state, many third world dictators, and generally the anti-American Cold War gang. In the 4 decades, I am using this, in fact, to give you the answer to the larger question as to how the India-US relationship has progressed through history. This is a proxy. Republic Day guests is a proxy for how India's foreign policy or India's big power relations have progressed over time. In the 4 decades between 1950 and 1990, only 3 US presidents visited India. That included Richard Nixon's one-day visit in 1969, which actually was a transit halt. After Bill Clinton came in 2000, in the Vajpayee era, both his successors, that is Bush and Obama, have showcased their India visits, and Obama traveled to India twice in his presidency. And then Donald Trump came to India as well in February 2020. Besides the fact that over the years, no American was ever given that honor, the Soviets and other Eastern Bloc / non-aligned strongmen were regular presence. Some like Marshal Tito of former Yugoslavia enjoying multiple appearances, 1968, 74, non-aligned movement, remember? They were the leaders of the then favored Afro-Asian nations, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Mobutu of Zaire, now Democratic Republic of Congo, that we spoke about in a full Katak letter the other day, about the war over the resources of DRC. It's Chinese. In 1958, that is Marshal Ye Jianying, who was the PLA chief then. He was the PLA chief. He was the chief guest in 1958. 1959, our first clashes took place. Even 2 Pakistanis, Malik Ghulam Muhammad, Governor General of Pakistan in 1955, and surprise of surprises, Rana Abdul Hamid. In 1965, he was Pakistan's Food and Agriculture Minister. And the idea with the Shastri government, you can't blame Nehru for this. The idea with the Shastri government was that this might help stabilize the situation, the relationship with Pakistan. He was the Republic Day chief guest in 1965. So the same Indian Armed Forces who marched down what used to be Rajpath, then saluting the Salami Manch with the Pakistani Food and Agriculture Minister Rana Abdul Hamid as the chief guest, were fighting a full-fledged war with the Pakistanis later in the same year. That was the 22-day war of attrition in September that year. We were willing to welcome leaders of China and Pakistan even as we fought with them over territory and ideology, but not those of the US and most other Western powers with whom we argued over ideology. If you scan history, the only Western leader, at least in a manner of speaking, who was invited during this entire period was Queen Elizabeth II in 1961, when Nehru's Raj nostalgia was still on. A British Prime Minister had to wait till 1993. It was John Major then. Why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you all this that India's relationship with America has changed dramatically in the last decades. And when you see what's going on right now, you have to keep all of that in perspective. Plus, you will also have to see the many downturns that we had. The biggest downturn was between 1971-72. That is when the Americans, Kissinger and Nixon, made their famous or infamous in history tilt towards Pakistan because they wanted to reach out to China. And that's what has left us Indians, multiple generations of Indians, with that awful memory of USS Enterprise, the 7th Fleet led by the USS Enterprise sailing towards the Bay of Bengal. Now, are we facing the same moment now? I've seen some anger in the social media, people saying, oh, this is the return of the USS Enterprise. This is the return of the 7th Fleet. I would say, as I said earlier, keep your seatbelts fastened and see how this moves, because much water has flown from the rivers of the subcontinent into the Bay of Bengal since 1971. That's a metaphor for saying that much has changed between Indian-American relations since 1971, particularly since 1991, since India's economic reform started. And this is a very different of India. The size and the stature and the clout of this India is very different from what it might have been in 1971, even relative to the state of the world then. That's the reason I say that it's fascinating how merely running your eye over the list of chief guests over these decades gives you an unambiguous overview of Indian foreign policy's total anti-Western toxification. That's the reason anti-Americanism comes so naturally to us. It is our default mindset. We were happy to host dictators and despots who probably laughed at the idea of a liberal constitutional republic. You'd be surprised that Fidel Castro and Egypt's Nasser somehow missed out. However, the house where I've lived for nearly 4 decades now, it's right next to one of Delhi's widest avenues named after Nasser. That's a part of the ring road, outer ring road in Delhi. The only Westerners to occasionally make it were marginal. Spain even more than Greece, in many ways were seen to be anti-West in several ways until then. You will also notice the French bucking the trend. They have made that hallowed podium 5 times, more than any other nation besides Bhutan actually. I'm not able to fully decode a Westophobic establishment's Francophilia over these decades, and maybe someone wiser can enlighten us at some point of time. I can only guess that while being a NATO ally, France was seen to be a critic of America and definitely superior culturally, seen as such in India. And the special relationship with the French was again underlined last year in January 2024, when Biden, after seemingly having committed to coming on Republic Day, said no. That is when the Pannu Tamasha was going on. And then at the last moment, Macron agreed to come as the chief guest. That's a very special India-French connection, or India's French connection, in a positive sense, not like the movie. And probably also because it was our only Western supplier of armaments starting in the 50s. And I suppose it did no harm that Indira Gandhi had learned French, but the French also made their first appearance only in 1976. A delicious reminder, it was the peak of the emergency and Mrs. Gandhi would have seen value in a Western republic's endorsement. No other Western country, definitely no other Western democracy, would accept to send its chief executive as the chief guest of Republic Day in emergency era India. And of course, there were Kenneth Konda of Zambia and liberal democracies like Poland and Bulgaria, who were pretty much part of the Soviet bloc. In fact, the national interest, where I had put more such data, I will share a link with you. You can read more examples. All I would say is our choice of foreign friends to honor over the years makes an incredibly accurate index of how our worldview has evolved, or rather remained frozen through those decades. It's only with the beginning of reform in 1991 and the end of the Cold War that the list becomes more diverse, though reluctantly. Britain, South Korea, Japan, even Nursultan Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan made the cut, but America had to wait till 2015. That tells you a story. 2015, and that is all. So significant was the shift, the invitation to Obama as the Republic Day chief guest, as the first American chief guest, that I called it the fourth significant shift since the reform began in 1991. The first big shift was P.V. Narasimha Rao establishing full diplomatic relations with Israel in January 1992. It was a very, very brave and risky decision for a Congress Prime Minister, particularly a non-Gandhi, leading a minority government. But the old fox had covered himself as only he could. He announced his decision when Yasser Arafat was in New Delhi and talked him into endorsing the decision at his press conference. You should see a national interest. I wrote about that. Headline Conscience and Cowardice. I will share a link with you. This shift was not so much about Israel or Palestine. This was basically to say that India was now moving away from its firm, frozen, anti-Western, non-aligned position. That's why I call it our first strategic shift. The second came under the next full-term Prime Minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee. He became the first Indian leader to hail America not merely as a strategic but as a natural ally. This is what unleashed a flurry of new engagement and quick US presidential visits. Vajpayee himself had maybe a generational gap and a personal chemistry gap with much younger American leaders Clinton and Bush, but he was well served by the team of Jaswant Singh, Brajesh Mishra and Yashwant Sinha, who not only believed in this continuing shift but also were its architects. It helped the subcontinent prevent war twice, in 1999 Kargil and 2002 after the Parliament attack. The re-education of the Indian mind on how old Cold War foes could now be allies had well and truly begun. That is under threat right now, and the fault lies with Donald Trump. The third shift came again under a Congress Prime Minister leading an unapologetically left-centrist coalition, with Manmohan Singh risking his government on the nuclear deal. And this was despite grave doubts within his party, from Sonia to Arjun Singh to Salman Khurshid. He chose losing the left allies and saw the deal through to its conclusion. I have always maintained that the nuclear deal was not really about energy, that was a nicer wrapping energy. Essentially, it was a strategic shift in the same way India saw the new world and now related to it. Modi's invitation to Obama as the Republic Day chief guest marked a fourth shift. Getting Obama at Republic Day, therefore, wasn't just another selfie moment. It completed a script that Rao began writing in January 1992. That is where I would come to the fifth shift. The fifth shift came under Narendra Modi. Narendra Modi then took that definition further. Not only did he repeatedly, first of all, he embraced the nuclear deal which the BJP had voted against in Parliament. Second, he repeatedly described this as an essential, natural, strategic alliance or partnership, and he built a good relationship with a series of American presidents: Obama, then Trump, then Biden, and then Trump to begin with. It's only now that this has hit a rock. This ship has hit some kind of a rock. It's not as if, like the Titanic, it has hit such a big iceberg that it has to go down. It's been rocked by something, and that situation needs watching with caution. We have to understand a few things. Trump said, for example, in his latest tweet that India is buying cheap Russian oil and selling it on open markets. First of all, a basic fact. India sells no crude on open markets. India is actually short of crude. India imports 88% of its need for petroleum. So how would it buy and sell any crude in open markets? That's nonsense, but that's the way Trump speaks. Trump also believes in shock and awe, and he does this shock and awe on social media. The second thing is, as the Indian spokesperson, MEA spokesperson pointed out in a long detailed statement, India only started buying this oil because a certain price band was fixed, that you can buy this at a particular price, which was lower than the global price, and it is adjusted to be kept lower than the global price. So one, the Russians get less profit, less money for their oil, and second, so that this supply of Russian oil does not go away from global markets. Today, it will be about 20-25% of the global oil supply. If it goes out of the global markets, global oil prices will go up, and that's the reason we also saw this old statement from the US ambassador earlier, Eric Garcetti, and that's a video where he says that Americans wanted India to start buying this oil to keep global oil prices also in control, also within limit. So India says not guilty. We did it because you wanted us to do it and we are not profiteering from it. That is the Indian answer. However, this situation is troublesome. I will quote Eshwar Prasad, Professor of Trade Policy and Economics from Cornell University, as quoted in Financial Times in a story by James Politi in Washington, D.C. and Andre Shipani in Delhi. He says, so much, and I quote, so much for the bromance between Modi and Trump and ostensibly close relationship between two budding geopolitical allies. And then he goes on to say, this is a tough and painful setback for India, which had come close to securing a phased trade deal and had been anticipating significant trade and investment benefits from being seen as a geopolitical ally of the US. I would, however, strike a note of caution because this is the Trump way of doing things. He's spoken like this about many countries and in the end either ended up having a deal, getting a deal, or sometimes continuing to build the pressure in the hope that he will get a better deal. All I would say in conclusion is, doesn't matter what the score is, what the asking rate is, this game is still on. There is turbulence, it will have your pulse racing. Keep that seatbelt on, but this will go a very long distance yet.